Case number 1. Ray Crone. A video overlay placing Ray Crone's dental cast over a photograph of bite marks became the prosecution's smoking gun. The jury watched as the teeth appeared to match the wounds on Kim Ancona's body. 2 separate juries, in 2 separate trials, saw the same video and convicted Crone of murder. The forensic odontologist presented the match as visual proof, infallible and absolute. Crone was sentenced to death, then to life in prison after a retrial. The video evidence was theater. 10 years later, DNA testing ruled out Crone and identified the real killer. Crone became the 100th person exonerated from death row in the United States. The teeth that nearly killed him belonged to the wrong man. The science was junk. Ray Lewis Crone was 35 in December 1991, a U.S. Air Force veteran working as a letter carrier for the United States Postal Service. He had an honorable discharge, a stable federal job, and no criminal record. He lived in Phoenix and played darts recreationally at the CBS Lounge, a local bar where he was a friendly regular. Crone had one distinctive physical feature: a severely misaligned jaw that gave him crooked, protruding teeth. The trait was visible to anyone who spoke with him. It made him recognizable. When Kim Ancona was murdered at the CBS Lounge and bite marks were found on her body, police immediately thought of Crone. His unusual teeth made him a suspect. The trait that made him memorable nearly destroyed his life. Kim Ancona, 36, managed the CBS Lounge. She was well-liked, a familiar face in the Phoenix bar scene, responsible for closing the venue after late shifts. She knew Crone casually from the Dart League, but had no close relationship with him. On the night of December 28, 1991, Ancona closed the bar alone around 2 a.m. It was routine work in an empty building. Her vulnerability was circumstantial. She was alone in a commercial space in the early morning hours, with no one nearby to hear or help. She was doing her job. Someone was waiting. The killer ambushed Ancona inside the bar after closing. She was sexually assaulted and stabbed repeatedly. Her body was dragged into the men's restroom in an attempt to conceal it. The attacker left blood spatters, bloody footprints, and bite marks on Ancona's breast and neck. Saliva was recovered from her tank top, but in 1991, DNA testing technology was not advanced enough to analyze it. The bite marks became the centerpiece of the forensic investigation. Approximately 6 hours later, a coworker arriving for the morning shift found Ancona's body. Police arrived within 15 minutes. The evidence suggested a crime of opportunity, sexual assault that escalated to murder. There was no indication of premeditation. Police began questioning people who frequented the bar. Crone's name surfaced immediately. Detectives knew he played darts there, and they knew he had distinctly misaligned teeth. When they brought him in for questioning, they focused on his dental structure. A critical piece of evidence should have cleared him. Crone's blood type did not match blood found at the scene. Investigators dismissed the discrepancy. 3 days after the murder, on December 31st, 1991, Crone was arrested in Phoenix and charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. Crone pleaded not guilty. His bond was denied. The first trial began in 1992 in Maricopa County Superior Court. Judge James E. McDougall presided. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on bite mark testimony from Dr. Raymond Rawson, a forensic odontologist. Dr. Rawson created a dental cast of Crone's teeth and presented a video overlay that appeared to show Crone's teeth matching the bite marks on Ancona's body. The video was compelling. It looked like scientific proof. The defense argued that Crone had no criminal history, no motive, and that his blood type excluded him. The prosecution countered with the video. After 2 days of deliberation, jurors found Crone guilty of first-degree murder. He wept openly as the verdict was read. Judge McDougall sentenced him to death. Victim impact statements from Ancona's family called for maximum punishment. Crone insisted he was innocent. Crone's attorneys won an appeal in 1996 after discovering that prosecutors had withheld video evidence. A retrial was ordered. In the second trial, the prosecution again relied on Dr. Rawson's bite mark testimony and the video overlay. A second jury convicted Crone. This time, the death sentence was reduced to life in prison. Crone remained incarcerated, proclaiming his innocence. In 2002, DNA testing technology had advanced enough to analyze the saliva recovered from Ancona's tank top. The results excluded Ray Crone completely. The DNA matched Kenneth Phillips, a man already imprisoned for another sexual assault. Investigators compared Phillips's dental structure to the bite marks. Phillips's teeth looked nothing like Crone's misaligned jaw. Crone walked free in April 2002 after serving 10 years, including time on death row. He was the 100th person exonerated from death row in the United States. Ray Crone is 67 years old. He lives in Tennessee and works as an advocate for justice reform. The video overlay that convinced 2 juries was visual deception presented as science. Crone's misaligned jaw made him a suspect, but the real killer's teeth bore no resemblance to the match forensic experts swore to in court. Kim Ancona was murdered by Kenneth Phillips, who was later imprisoned for a different crime while Crone sat on death row. The bite mark evidence was junk science. The blood type mismatch was ignored. 2 juries convicted an innocent man based on a video that looked convincing but proved nothing. Crone became a symbol for the failure of bite mark forensics. The 100th exoneration, 10 years lost. The teeth never matched. Case number 2. Robert Lee Stinson. The forensic experts didn't just make a mistake. Evidence later revealed that Dr. L.T. Johnson and Dr. Raymond Rawson actively miscalibrated their physical models to force Robert Lee Stinson's heavily misaligned teeth to appear to match the bite marks on Iona Gronowski's body. The fabrication was deliberate. Stinson spent 24 years in prison for a murder committed by a man with perfectly straight teeth. When DNA testing excluded Stinson in 2009, investigators examined the original forensic work and discovered the manipulation. The experts had altered their models to create a match that did not exist. The junk science was not an error. It was fraud. Robert Lee Stinson was 20 years old in November 1984, living in a working-class Milwaukee neighborhood. He worked occasional labor jobs, had a high school equivalent education, and was known to local police for minor infractions. Nothing violent, nothing serious. He was single, lower income, described by neighbors as quiet. His most distinctive physical feature was his severely misaligned front teeth, crooked and protruding in a way that made them immediately noticeable. Stinson lived next door to Iona Gronowski. They were neighbors, close enough that their properties shared a boundary, but not close. When Gronowski was murdered, police canvassed the area and questioned everyone nearby. Detectives noticed Stinson's teeth. The bite marks on Gronowski's body became the entire case against him. Iona Gronowski, 63, was retired and living alone in her Milwaukee home. She managed her household independently despite her age. On the night of November 3rd, 1984, she was in the rear yard of her home when she was attacked. Her age and living situation made her vulnerable. The attack occurred in darkness, in the private space behind her house where she should have been safe. She knew Stinson as the neighbor next door, a familiar face, but no real relationship. That proximity gave police a suspect. Gronowski was ambushed, beaten, stabbed, and bitten. The violence was extreme. November 3rd, 1984. Iona Gronowski was attacked in the rear yard of her home. The assailant beat her, stabbed her, and bit her repeatedly. The bite marks were massive and vicious, covering her breasts and abdomen. The attack included sexual assault. After Gronowski was dead, the killer left her body in the bushes behind the house. A neighbor discovered the body and called police. Investigators documented the scene and collected evidence: semen, blood, and extensive bite marks. The bite marks were so severe that forensic odontologists would later describe them as among the most dramatic they had encountered. The attacker had left biological evidence: saliva in the bite wounds, semen at the scene. In 1984, DNA testing was not available. The bite marks became the prosecution's primary forensic tool. Milwaukee police questioned neighbors. During an interview with Robert Lee Stinson, detectives immediately focused on his teeth. His misaligned dental structure was obvious and abnormal. Investigators brought in forensic odontologists Dr. L.T. Johnson and Dr. Raymond Rawson to examine the bite marks and compare them to Stinson's teeth. The experts spent months analyzing the evidence. In early 1985, Stinson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Wisconsin does not have the death penalty, so he faced life in prison without parole. He pleaded not guilty. The case against him was almost entirely circumstantial, built on the assertion that his teeth matched the wounds on Gronowski's body. There was no eyewitness, no confession, no direct physical evidence tying him to the crime beyond the expert testimony. The trial took place in December 1985 in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. The prosecution's case rested on the testimony of Dr. L.T. Johnson and Dr. Raymond Rawson. Both experts testified that the bite marks on Gronowski's body had to have been made by teeth identical to those of Robert Lee Stinson, to the exclusion of all other people on Earth. They presented their conclusions as absolute scientific certainty. The defense had no resources to hire competing experts. The verdict came quickly. Stinson was found guilty of first-degree murder in December 1985. He was 21 years old. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Stinson swore he was not the killer. No one listened. Stinson was imprisoned in Wisconsin in 1985 and remained there for 24 years. Appeals were filed and denied. In 2009, advances in DNA technology allowed attorneys to secure testing on the saliva recovered from the bite marks and the semen found at the crime scene. The DNA results completely excluded Robert Lee Stinson. The biological evidence matched a different man, Moses Price. Investigators compared Price's dental structure to the bite marks. Moses Price had perfectly straight teeth, the exact opposite of Stinson's severely misaligned dental abnormality. Attorneys examined the original forensic analysis conducted by Dr. Johnson and Dr. Rawson. They discovered that the experts had deliberately miscalibrated their physical models to make Stinson's teeth appear to fit the bite marks. The manipulation was intentional. The match was fabricated. Robert Lee Stinson was exonerated in 2009 after serving 24 years in prison. He filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the forensic experts who testified against him. The case established a legal precedent. Forensic experts can be held civilly liable if they deliberately fabricate evidence. Stinson's lawsuit succeeded. Stinson lost 24 years to evidence that experts deliberately manipulated, while the real killer, a man with perfectly straight teeth, remained free until DNA proved the fabrication. Case number 3, William Richards. It took 4 separate trials to convict William Richards. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second was dismissed. The third hung again. prosecutors could not break the deadlock with the evidence they had until the fourth trial, when they introduced bite mark testimony. Dr. Norman Sperber testified that a crescent-shaped mark on Pamela Richards' hand matched an abnormality in William's teeth possessed by only 2% of the population. The jury convicted. 23 years later, DNA testing proved Richards was not the killer, and Dr. Sperber recanted in a signed affidavit, admitting he was entirely wrong. The bite mark evidence was introduced as a desperation tactic after 3 juries refused to convict. It worked. The science was worthless. William J. Richards was 43 in August 1993. A college-educated mechanical engineer, living an off-grid lifestyle in the high desert of San Bernardino County, California. He and his wife, Pamela, lived in a remote RV on a property without electricity, miles from the nearest neighbors. Richards was private, quiet, described as a professional who valued isolation. He had no criminal record. The couple had been married for years but had no children. By 1993, the marriage was strained. They lived in extreme geographic isolation, surrounded by desert, far from roads, with no infrastructure. That isolation would become central to the prosecution's case. No witnesses, no one to hear. Total privacy for violence. Pamela Richards, 43, worked as a waitress and lived with William in the remote RV. Their off-grid existence meant Pamela was completely isolated. There was no electricity, no phone, no immediate access to help. The nearest road was far. She was alone with William in the vast emptiness of the California high desert. On the night of August 10th, 1993, Pamela was at the RV while William worked. Her isolation made her vulnerable. If something happened, no one would hear. The desert would swallow the crime. August 10th, 1993, approximately 11:30 p.m. Pamela Richards was beaten to death outside the RV in Hesperia, California. She was struck with rocks, strangled, and her skull was crushed with a cinder block. The cinder block was left at the scene, covered in blood. The violence was extreme and sustained. The timeline was tight. William Richards clocked out of work at 11:03 p.m. The drive home took approximately 30 to 40 minutes. He called 911 at 11:58 p.m., reporting that he had found Pamela dead. Police arrived at 12:32 a.m. The scene was chaotic. Pamela's body showed massive trauma. Blood covered the ground. Rocks and the cinder block were nearby. A crescent-shaped injury was visible on Pamela's hand. Investigators photographed it, but did not immediately understand its significance. Police investigated William Richards as the primary suspect. The timeline was narrow. He had clocked out at 11:03 p.m. and called 911 at 11:58 p.m., a window of less than an hour. But there were problems with the case. Police left the crime scene unattended for hours, and stray dogs wandered through, contaminating evidence. There were no eyewitnesses, and no forensic evidence directly linking Richards to the murder. The crescent-shaped mark on Pamela's hand was documented but unexplained. Within weeks, Richards was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. The case went to trial in the mid-1990s. The first jury hung. The second trial was dismissed. The third jury deadlocked again. Prosecutors were stuck. The fourth trial began in San Bernardino County Superior Court. The prosecution was desperate. 3 juries had refused to convict on the existing evidence. This time, prosecutors introduced a new witness, Dr. Norman Sperber, a forensic odontologist. Dr. Sperber testified that the crescent-shaped mark on Pamela's hand was a bite mark. He claimed it matched an abnormality in William Richards' teeth, a specific dental characteristic found in only 2% of the population. The testimony was presented as scientific certainty. a statistical rarity that placed Richards at the scene. The fourth jury heard the bite mark evidence and convicted William Richards of first-degree murder. The deadlock was broken. Richards was sentenced to 25 years to life. Richards began serving his sentence in California in 1997. Appeals were filed. In 2007, DNA testing was conducted on the cinder block that killed Pamela and on a hair found under her fingernails. The DNA completely excluded William Richards. The results pointed to an unknown male. Dr. Norman Sperber, the expert who testified at the fourth trial, reviewed his own work. He recanted completely. In a signed affidavit, Sperber admitted he was entirely wrong. The crescent-shaped mark was not a bite mark. It did not match Richards' teeth. The 2% abnormality testimony was baseless. The conviction was overturned in 2016 after Richards served 23 years in prison. He sued San Bernardino County. The case directly led to California, passing Senate Bill 1058, known as the Junk Science Bill, which allows prisoners to seek exoneration when an expert recants their testimony. William Richards is 74 years old. He was released in 2016 after DNA excluded him, and the expert who convicted him admitted the science was junk. It took 4 trials to convict Richards because the evidence failed 3 times. When prosecutors finally introduced bite mark testimony in the 4th trial, the desperation tactic worked. 23 years later, Dr. Sperber recanted, California changed its law, and the cinder block DNA pointed elsewhere. Case number 4, Stephen Mark Chaney. The prosecutor told the jury that the bite mark match was better than eyewitness testimony. Dr. Jim Hales testified there was a 1 in a million chance the bite mark on John Sweek's arm belonged to anyone other than Stephen Mark Chaney. The statement was presented as mathematical certainty, forensic proof more reliable than a witness placing Chaney at the scene. Jurors believed the science and convicted. 28 years later, DNA testing eliminated Chaney as the source, and Dr. Hales signed an affidavit declaring his own testimony scientifically indefensible. The case triggered a historic review by the Texas Forensic Science Commission of every conviction in the state based on bite mark evidence. The 1 in a million certainty was a lie. Stephen Mark Chaney was 31 in June 1987, a construction worker in Dallas with a history of minor drug offenses. He was known in certain circles as a drug user, part of the street-level narcotics trade that connected users and dealers in low-income neighborhoods. Chaney had no history of violence. He was not wealthy, not educated, not well-connected. When John and Sally Sweek were murdered in their Dallas apartment, investigators found a drug ledger listing transactions. Chaney's name was in the ledger. That detail made him a suspect. His teeth made him a convict. John Sweek, 27, and Sally Sweek, 21, were known narcotics sellers operating out of their Dallas residence. They dealt drugs to users in the area, including Stephen Chaney. On June 20th, 1987, someone entered their apartment and attacked them. Both were stabbed and slashed multiple times. The violence was frenzied. Blood covered the apartment. The killer walked through the blood, leaving shoe prints. Dozens of fingerprints were recovered. A distinct bite mark was found on John Sweek's arm. The crime appeared to be motivated by robbery or a drug debt. The killer left a chaotic scene with extensive physical evidence. A family member discovered the bodies and called police. Investigators processed the scene and recovered blood evidence, fingerprints, shoe prints, and the bite mark on John Sweek's arm. The drug ledger found in the apartment listed names and amounts owed. Stephen Chaney's name appeared in the ledger. Police brought him in for questioning. Forensic odontologist Dr. Jim Hales was called to examine the bite mark and compare it to Cheney's teeth. Dr. Hales concluded that Cheney's teeth matched the bite mark. Cheney was arrested and charged with capital murder. The case against him relied almost entirely on the bite mark testimony. The fingerprints at the scene did not match Cheney. The shoe prints did not match his shoes. The ledger placed him in the Sweeck's orbit, but it did not place him at the murder. The bite mark became everything. The trial began in October 1987 in Dallas County. Dr. Jim Hales testified for the prosecution. He told the jury that there was a 1 in a million chance the bite mark on John Sweeck's arm belonged to anyone other than Stephen Cheney. The prosecutor reinforced the testimony, telling jurors the bite mark match was better than eyewitness testimony, more reliable, more certain, grounded in science. The defense had no resources to counter the expert. The jury deliberated and convicted Cheney of murder in December 1987. He was sentenced to life in prison. Cheney maintained his innocence. The courtroom moved on. Cheney arrived at a Texas prison and remained there for 28 years. In 2015, advances in DNA technology allowed testing on biological material recovered from under the victim's fingernails. The DNA completely excluded Stephen Cheney. The results pointed to an unknown individual. Attorneys for Cheney contacted Dr. Jim Hales and asked him to review his original testimony. Dr. Hales examined the evidence again and signed an affidavit. He declared his trial testimony scientifically indefensible. The 1 in a million statistic was baseless. The bite mark comparison methodology was unreliable. Cheney was cleared of all charges in October 2015. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals declared him actually innocent. The case triggered an unprecedented response. The Texas Forensic Science Commission launched a historic review of every conviction in the state based on bite mark evidence. Stephen Mark Cheney is 68 years old. The prosecutor called the bite mark match better than eyewitness testimony, a 1 in a million certainty that convinced the jury to convict. 28 years later, Dr. Hales admitted the statistics were baseless, and Texas launched a historic review of every bite mark conviction in the state. Case number 5, Gerard Richardson. 2 board-certified forensic odontologists examined the same bite mark on Monica Reyes' body and reached opposite conclusions. The defense hired Dr. Norman Sperber, who testified the mark was not made by Gerard Richardson, a complete exclusion. The prosecution hired Dr. Ira Tatunik, who testified there was no question Richardson made the mark. Absolute certainty. The jury heard both experts present contradictory scientific conclusions about identical evidence. They chose to believe the prosecution. Richardson was sentenced to 30 years without parole. 19 years later, DNA testing on saliva swabbed from the bite mark yielded a complete profile that excluded Richardson entirely. The jury had flipped a coin between 2 experts. They picked wrong. Gerard Richardson was 29 in February 1994, a street-level drug supplier in New Jersey with a prior conviction for drug distribution. He sold narcotics to users in the area, including Monica Reyes. Richardson was not violent, not wealthy, not sophisticated. He operated on the margins of the local drug economy, supplying small amounts to people struggling with addiction. When Monica Reyes was murdered, police looked for anyone connected to her. A boyfriend mentioned that Reyes owed Richardson $90 for drugs. That detail made Richardson a suspect. A bite mark on Reyes' back made him a defendant. Monica Reyes, 19, was unemployed and battling severe addiction. She relied on drugs to function and owed money to multiple people, including Gerard Richardson. Her addiction made her vulnerable. On February 20th, 1994, Reyes was beaten, strangled, and stabbed. Her body was dumped in a snow-covered ditch in Bernards Township, New Jersey. 50-pound rocks were placed on her head and feet, an attempt to weigh down the body and conceal it. She had been killed elsewhere and transported to the dump site. Her life had been defined by addiction. Her death was brutal. A passerby found Monica Reyes' body in the ditch. Police responded and processed the scene. The body showed signs of severe trauma: beating, strangulation, stab wounds. A bite mark was visible on the lower left side of her back. Investigators documented the mark and collected evidence. The boyfriend, who had been questioned early in the investigation, mentioned that Reyes owed Gerard Richardson money for drugs. Richardson became a suspect. Forensic odontologists were brought in to examine the bite mark and compare it to Richardson's teeth. The case was built almost entirely on the bite mark evidence. There was no eyewitness, no direct physical evidence tying Richardson to the crime scene, no confession. The trial took place in late 1995 in Somerset County, New Jersey. The defense hired Dr. Norman Sperber, a respected forensic odontologist, to examine the bite mark. Dr. Sperber testified that the mark on Monica Reyes' back was not made by Gerard Richardson. He stated this as a complete exclusion. Richardson's teeth did not match. The prosecution hired Dr. Ira Tatunik, another forensic odontologist. Dr. Tatunik examined the same bite mark and testified there was no question Gerard Richardson made the mark. He presented his conclusion as absolute certainty. The jury heard two board-certified experts look at identical evidence and reach completely opposite scientific conclusions. One said 100% exclusion. The other said 100% match. The jury chose to believe Dr. Tatunik. Richardson was convicted of murder in November 1995. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Richardson entered the New Jersey prison system in 1995. Appeals were filed and denied. In 2013, advances in DNA technology allowed testing on the saliva swab taken from the bite mark on Monica Reyes' body. YSTR DNA testing yielded a complete male profile. The DNA completely excluded Gerard Richardson. The biological evidence pointed to an unknown individual. Richardson was exonerated in December 2013 after serving 19 years in prison. The bite mark that two experts examined and interpreted in opposite ways had left saliva that told the truth. Richardson's DNA was not there. Gerard Richardson is 60 years old. He was exonerated in 2013 after DNA excluded him completely. Two experts, same bite mark. One testified it was absolutely not Richardson. The other testified it was absolutely Richardson. The jury picked the prosecution's expert. There was no science guiding the choice, just preference. 19 years later, DNA proved the defense expert was right. The saliva in the bite mark belonged to someone else. The jury flipped a coin between contradictory testimony presented as certainty. They chose wrong. Monica Reyes was killed by someone whose DNA was on her body. Gerard Richardson spent 19 years in prison because a jury believed one expert over another when both were looking at the same evidence. The science was arbitrary. The DNA was not. Case number 6, Eddie Lee Howard. The initial autopsy of Georgia Kemp's body noted 0 bite marks. Dr. Stephen Hain, the medical examiner, documented stab wounds, strangulation, blunt force trauma, and sexual assault. He made no mention of bite marks. Days later, Dr. Michael West, a forensic odontologist, requested that the body be exhumed. The exhumation was approved. Dr. West examined the body using a blue light and claimed to find bite marks that were invisible to the naked eye. He testified that the marks, which only he could see under UV light, perfectly matched Eddie Lee Howard's teeth. Howard spent 28 years on death row, based on marks the medical examiner couldn't see, discovered only by a maverick dentist with a blacklight. Eddie Lee Howard Jr. was 38 in February 1992, living in Columbia, Mississippi. with prior convictions on his record. He was known to local law enforcement. When Georgia Kemp was murdered, Howard became a suspect based on circumstantial factors and proximity. He had no clear motive and no documented connection to Kemp. The case against him would rest entirely on forensic testimony that defied conventional medical examination. Georgia Kemp, 82, was elderly and living alone in Columbia, Mississippi. Her age and isolation made her vulnerable. On the night of February 2nd, 1992, someone broke into her home. The intruder cut the phone lines, attacked Kemp, and set a fire in the living room. Kemp was beaten, strangled, raped, and stabbed. The violence was extreme. The fire was intended to destroy evidence. Neighbors reported the fire, and firefighters responded. Firefighters extinguished the blaze and discovered Georgia Kemp's body inside the home. Police processed the scene and found a knife on the bed. The medical examiner, Dr. Stephen Hain, conducted the autopsy. He documented extensive injuries: beating, strangulation, sexual assault, stab wounds. He made no mention of bite marks. Days later, Dr. Michael West, a forensic odontologist known for unconventional methods, contacted authorities and requested that Kemp's body be exhumed. The request was granted. Dr. West examined the exhumed body using a blue light. He claimed to find bite marks that were invisible under normal examination. He testified that the marks matched Eddie Lee Howard's teeth. Howard was arrested and charged with capital murder. The first trial resulted in a conviction, but it was overturned on appeal. A retrial took place in 2000. Dr. Michael West testified that the bite marks he discovered using UV light were a definitive match to Howard's teeth. The prosecution presented the testimony as scientific proof. The defense had no resources to counter the claim. The jury convicted Howard of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. Howard was sent to Mississippi's death row. Howard remained on death row for 28 years. In 2019, DNA testing was conducted on biological evidence recovered from the crime scene, including DNA from the knife blade and clothing. The results completely excluded Eddie Lee Howard. The DNA pointed to an unknown male. Attorneys petitioned for Howard's release. In January 2021, the Mississippi Supreme Court vacated Howard's conviction. He was declared innocent and released after spending 28 years on death row. Dr. Michael West's bite mark testimony, based on marks invisible to the medical examiner and visible only under UV light, was discredited. Eddie Lee Howard is 70 years old. He was released in January 2021 after DNA excluded him completely. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy saw no bite marks. Dr. Michael West exhumed the body, used a blue light, and claimed to see marks no one else could. He testified those invisible marks matched Howard perfectly. 28 years on death row. DNA testing excluded Howard and pointed elsewhere. The knife held someone else's DNA. The marks the medical examiner couldn't see became the evidence that nearly executed an innocent man. The black light found what wasn't there. 28 years, death row, invisible evidence. Case number 7, Charles McCrory. 2 tiny puncture marks on Julie Bonds' arm became the evidence that convicted Charles McCrory of murdering his estranged wife. Dr. Richard Souviron, the forensic odontologist, famous for his testimony in the Ted Bundy trial, examined the marks and testified they were bite marks made by McCrory's teeth. The jury was influenced by Souviron's celebrity status, the expert who helped convict one of America's most notorious serial killers. 36 years later, Dr. Souviron completely recanted. He reviewed his own testimony and admitted that modern science would not even classify the injury as a human bite mark, let alone identify a suspect from it. The punctures were nondescript. The science was baseless. McCrory spent 36 years in prison because a celebrity expert said so. Charles M. McCrory lived in Andalusia, Alabama, and was estranged from his wife, Julie Bonds McCrory, in May 1985. The marriage had failed, and the separation was contentious. McCrory became the immediate prime suspect when Julie was found dead. As the estranged husband, he fit the statistical profile for domestic homicide. The relationship had deteriorated. Investigators focused on him from the beginning. Julie Bonds McCrory, 24, was estranged from Charles and trying to build a life separate from the marriage. On May 31st, 1985, she was severely beaten. The attack was brutal. She died from her injuries. Her body showed extensive trauma. 2 tiny puncture marks were visible on her arm. The marks were small, barely noticeable. Investigators documented them during the examination. Police arrested Charles McCrory as the primary suspect. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial. He was the estranged husband. He had motive in the failed marriage, and he had access. But there was no direct physical evidence tying him to the beating. Prosecutors needed something stronger. They brought in Dr. Richard Souviron, the forensic odontologist who had testified in the Ted Bundy case and helped secure Bundy's conviction with bite mark evidence. Souviron examined the 2 tiny puncture marks on Julie's arm. He testified that the marks were bite marks made by Charles McCrory's teeth. The trial took place in 1985 in Alabama. Dr. Souviron's testimony carried enormous weight. The jury knew his name from the Bundy case. He was a celebrity expert, a forensic odontologist whose testimony had helped convict one of the most infamous killers in American history. When he testified that the punctures on Julie's arm were bite marks matching McCrory's teeth, jurors believed him, and McCrory was found guilty. McCrory was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He still insists he was innocent. The courtroom was unmoved. McCrory entered the Alabama prison system in 1985 and remained there for 36 years. In the decades that followed, forensic science evolved. Bite mark analysis fell into disrepute. Studies showed the methodology was unreliable, subjective, and incapable of definitively identifying individuals. Dr. Richard Souviron reviewed his own testimony in the McCrory case. He completely recanted. In a signed statement, Souviron admitted that modern forensic science would not even classify the 2 punctures on Julie Bonds' arm as a human bite mark, let alone use them to identify a specific person. The marks were nondescript, ambiguous, and scientifically worthless as evidence. In 2021, McCrory was offered a deal: plead guilty to a lesser charge and be released immediately, or continue fighting and remain in prison indefinitely. He accepted the deal to escape prison, though he maintains absolute innocence. Charles McCrory is free. He was released in 2021 after serving 36 years. He maintains he is innocent, but accepted a plea deal to leave prison. Dr. Richard Souviron, the expert whose testimony convicted him, recanted completely. The 2 tiny punctures on Julie Bonds' arm were not bite marks. They could not identify anyone. The jury convicted McCrory because the expert who testified against Ted Bundy said the marks matched. Celebrity trumped science. 36 years later, the expert admitted the science was never there. 2 nondescript punctures, a famous name, a life sentence. The marks were not bite marks at all. Case number 8, Gary Sifizari. Dr. Lowell Levine testified that the bite mark on Tauno Bjornavold's body was a definite match to Gary Sifizari's teeth. The testimony was presented as forensic certainty. The verdict was guilty. Gary was convicted of beating 75-year-old Bjornavold to death in his Milford, Massachusetts apartment. Prosecutors pursued an extreme theory. Gary and his brother Michael had participated jointly in a frenzied attack, biting and beating the elderly man. 35 years later, DNA testing on the original swab from the bite mark ruled out Gary Sifizari. The DNA matched Michael Giroux, a different local man who had died in 2014. Gary spent 35 years in prison because a forensic odontologist said the bite mark was his. The DNA said otherwise. Gary Cifizari was 22 in September 1984, living in Milford, Massachusetts, with his brother Michael. The brothers were known in the neighborhood but had no history of extreme violence. When Tano Bjornevold, a 75-year-old retired machine operator, was found beaten to death in his apartment, Gary and Michael became targets of police investigation. They lived nearby and were familiar to local law enforcement. The case against Gary would rest on bite mark testimony and the theory that the brothers had attacked Bjornevold together. Tano Bjornevold, 75, was a retired machine operator living alone in his Milford apartment. His age and isolation made him vulnerable. In September 1984, someone entered his apartment and beat him to death. The violence was severe. A vicious bite mark was left on Bjornevold's body. The bite mark became the primary forensic evidence. Investigators swabbed the mark and preserved the sample. The attacker had left biological evidence. Police questioned Gary and Michael Cifizari as potential suspects. Forensic odontologist Dr. Lowell Levine was brought in to examine the bite mark. Dr. Levine compared the mark to Gary Cifizari's teeth and testified that the bite mark was a definite match. The prosecution built a theory that Gary and Michael had participated together in a frenzied attack on Bjornevold. The bite mark testimony anchored the case. Gary was arrested and charged with murder. The trial took place in late 1984. Dr. Lowell Levine testified that the bite mark on Bjornevold's body definitively matched Gary Cifizari's teeth. The prosecution presented the joint attack theory, arguing that the brothers had worked together to kill the elderly man. The defense had no resources to counter the forensic testimony. The jury convicted Gary Cifizari of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He insisted he was innocent. The bite mark evidence was treated as unassailable. Gary was sent to a Massachusetts facility in 1984 and remained there for 35 years. In 2019, advances in DNA technology allowed testing on the original swab taken from the bite mark on Bjornevold's body. The DNA results completely excluded Gary Cifizari. The biological evidence matched a different man, Michael Giroux, a local resident who had died in 2014. Giroux had never been investigated in connection with Bjornevold's murder. The DNA proved that Gary Cifizari's teeth had not made the bite mark. Dr. Levine's testimony was wrong. 2019. The conviction was vacated after Gary served 35 years in prison. Gary Cifizari is 62 years old. He was released in 2019 after DNA excluded him and identified the real killer. Dr. Lowell Levine testified the bite mark was a definite match to Gary's teeth. The prosecution claimed Gary and his brother attacked Bjornevold together in a frenzy. The jury convicted based on the bite mark certainty. 35 years later, the DNA from the bite mark matched Michael Giroux, a man who had died years earlier without ever being connected to the crime. The definite match was wrong. The joint attack theory was fiction. Gary lost 35 years to a bite mark that wasn't his. The real killer's DNA was on the victim's body all along. Case number 9, John Prant. The bite mark on Carla Brown's neck was heavily distorted because her body had been submerged in a barrel of water. The skin was warped, swollen, degraded. Forensic odontologists Dr. Homer Campbell and Dr. Lowell Levine examined the distorted mark and testified that spaces in the victim's skin matched spaces in John Prant's teeth. They claimed mathematical certainty. Prante was convicted and sentenced to 75 years, effectively life in prison. 19 years later, DNA, testing on trace evidence from Carla Brown's body completely excluded Pranta. The bite mark analysis had claimed precision from a water-damaged, distorted wound. The certainty was impossible. The science was junk. John Pranta was 28 in June 1978, part of a group of friends in Wood River, Illinois, who knew Carla Brown socially. Pranta had no history of violence. He was connected to Brown through mutual acquaintances, but had no documented close relationship with her. When Brown was murdered in 1978, the case went cold. It remained unsolved until 1982, when bite mark photo enhancement technology was introduced. The new technology allowed forensic odontologists to analyze the distorted mark on Brown's neck. Pranta became a suspect. The bite mark made him a convict. Carla Brown, 22, was a college student living at home with her family in Wood River, Illinois. On June 21, 1978, she was attacked in the basement of her home. She was strangled and her head was submerged in a barrel of water. The submersion was an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. Her body was left in the barrel. The water caused massive distortion to the tissues. A faint bite mark was visible on her neck, but the submersion had warped the skin. The mark was unclear, degraded, and heavily distorted. Carla Brown's body was discovered in the basement. Police processed the scene and recovered trace evidence. The bite mark on her neck was documented, but forensic technology in 1978 was limited. The case went cold. In 1982, advances in bite mark photo enhancement allowed investigators to revisit the evidence. Forensic odontologists were brought in to examine enhanced photographs of the distorted mark. John Pranta was part of the social circle that knew Brown. His name surfaced during the reinvestigation. Dr. Homer Campbell and Dr. Lowell Levine analyzed the bite mark and compared it to Pranta's teeth. The trial took place in 1983. Dr. Homer Campbell and Dr. Lowell Levine testified that the bite mark on Carla Brown's neck, despite being heavily distorted from water submersion, matched John Pranta's teeth. They claimed that spaces in the skin corresponded to spaces in Pranta's dental structure. The testimony was presented as scientifically certain, a mathematical match. The defense argued that the distortion from water submersion made any analysis unreliable. The jury believed the experts. Pranta was convicted of murder and sentenced to 75 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. He maintained his innocence. Pranta entered the Illinois prison system in 1983. In 2002, DNA testing technology had advanced enough to analyze trace evidence recovered from Carla Brown's body. The DNA results completely excluded John Pranta. The biological evidence pointed to an unknown male. Pranta was exonerated in 2002 after serving 19 years in prison. The bite mark that experts claimed matched his teeth with mathematical certainty had been so distorted by water submersion that any analysis was speculative. The DNA told the truth. Pranta's DNA was not on Carla Brown's body. John Pranta was released in 2002 after DNA excluded him. The bite mark on Carla Brown's neck was submerged in water, causing massive tissue distortion. Forensic odontologists claimed they could match the warped skin to Pranta's teeth with mathematical precision. The claim was absurd. Water distorts tissue. Skin swells and degrades. The spaces the experts claimed to match were artifacts of decomposition and submersion. 19 years later, DNA proved Pranta was not the killer. The bite mark analysis extracted certainty from distortion. The science claimed precision where none was possible. 75 years. Distorted evidence. The DNA excluded him completely. Case number 10. Robert Dubois. Dr. Richard Souviron created a beeswax mold of Robert Dubois's teeth and used it to link Dubois to a bite mark on Barbara Graham's cheek. The beeswax mold was presented to the jury as scientific proof, a physical representation of Dubois's dental structure overlaid on the victim's wound. Jailhouse snitches testified that Dubois had confessed. The jury convicted Dubois of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. 37 years later, a rape kit that officials claimed had been destroyed was found in a medical examiner's office. DNA testing on the kit excluded Dubois completely and matched two known serial offenders, Amos Robinson and Abron Scott. Modern forensic pathologists reviewed the injury on Graham's cheek and concluded it was not even a human bite mark. Dubois spent nearly 40 years in prison for a crime committed by two other men, convicted on junk science and lies. Robert Dubois was 18 in August 1983, living in Tampa, Florida, with a history of minor teenage infractions. He was not violent, not sophisticated, not connected to any serious criminal enterprise. When Barbara Graham was murdered behind a dental clinic in Tampa, police had little evidence. An informant claimed Dubois liked to cause trouble. That vague accusation made him a suspect. His teeth made him a death row inmate. Barbara Graham, 19, worked at a restaurant in a local Tampa mall. She was walking home from her shift in August 1983 when she was attacked. Graham was beaten, raped, and murdered behind a dental clinic. Her body was found with a supposed bite mark on her left cheek. She was young, working a regular job, walking home through a route she knew. The attack was random, brutal, and fatal. Police investigated and found little physical evidence. A supposed bite mark was visible on Barbara Graham's cheek. Forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Souveron, the same expert who had testified in other high-profile cases, was brought in to examine the mark. An informant told police that Robert Dubois liked to cause trouble and might be involved. Dubois was arrested. Dr. Souveron created a beeswax mold of Dubois's teeth and compared it to the wound on Graham's cheek. He testified that the bite mark definitively matched Dubois. Jailhouse informants seeking reduced sentences claimed Dubois had confessed to them in jail. The case was built on the bite mark and the snitches. The trial took place in 1985. Dr. Richard Souveron testified that the beeswax mold of Dubois's teeth matched the bite mark on Barbara Graham's cheek. The physical mold was presented to the jury as tangible scientific evidence. Jailhouse snitches testified that Dubois had confessed. The defense had no resources to counter the expert or impeach the informants. The jury convicted Dubois of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was later reduced to life in prison. Dubois maintained his innocence. No one listened. Dubois entered Florida's prison system in 1985 and remained there for 37 years. In 2020, attorneys working on Dubois's case discovered that a rape kit collected from Barbara Graham's body, which officials had claimed was destroyed, had been stored in a medical examiner's office for decades. DNA testing was conducted on the rape kit. The results excluded Robert Dubois completely. The DNA matched two known serial offenders, Amos Robinson and Abron Scott. Both men had committed other crimes and were known to law enforcement. Modern forensic pathologists reviewed the injury on Graham's cheek. They concluded it was not a human bite mark. The beeswax mold, the expert testimony, and the bite mark identification were all based on junk science. Dubois was exonerated in September 2020 after serving 37 years. Robert Dubois is 59 years old. He was released in September 2020 and settled a lawsuit against the city of Tampa for $14 million. Dr. Richard Souveron created a beeswax mold and told the jury it matched the bite mark on Barbara Graham's cheek. Jailhouse snitches lied for reduced sentences. The jury convicted Dubois and sent him to death row. 37 years later, a rape kit officials said was destroyed turned up in a medical examiner's office. DNA excluded Dubois and matched Amos Robinson and Abron Scott, 2 serial offenders. Modern pathologists reviewed the mark and said it was not a human bite mark. The beeswax proof was theater. The informants were liars. The bite mark was not a bite mark. Nearly 40 years. 2 other men committed the crime. The science was junk from the beginning.